Absolutely. Vincent, do you want to take us away?
Yes, let me share my screen if that's all right. All right. Well, good morning. I am Vincent Tinker. I'm the K-12 literacy coach for social studies, and with us is Ryan New, who's our instructional lead. Today we're going to talk about engagement, specifically with how we can bring engagement into the social studies model. Social studies, we look at questions, we look at sources, and we look at tasks. And one of the things that the students are mostly engaged in for the bulk of any of our lessons is looking at sources. And so today we're going to look at our source analysis tool and how to bring questions that really engage students in the sources, but also can help facilitate great discussion within the classroom. And the source analysis tool is going to be our focus for this today. So to start us off, we're going to look at some of the literacies that exist within social studies. We have content literacy, disciplinary literacy, critical literacy, and information literacy. Today specifically, we're going to be looking at disciplinary literacy and critical literacy. That is what we have on our source analysis tool. Disciplinary literacy, as you see here, it's the reading, writing, and thinking within a discipline. Typically, this is when you hear about think like a historian or think like a geographer. For disciplinary literacy, we try to get our students to think about how do professionals in those fields actually approach their topic. What questions would they ask? How would they think about it? What are their methods and processes that they would approach their subject if they're a historian or a geographer or an economist? How would they approach that? That is disciplinary literacy. And critical literacy is looking at the relationship of power and the relationship between the reader and the language that's within a text or within a source, and looking at how the students move into those. We look at three different aspects of our framework, which is identity, disrupting sources, and taking action to promote social justice. And those are the two that we're going to be focusing on today with our source analysis tool. So remember, the source analysis tool and engaging students is all about trying to bring questions that will really help out our teachers and our students into the sources and to facilitate discussion. So we have our source analysis tool here. This is our middle school and high school source analysis tool. And we have it organized in the categories of disciplinary literacy. So our categories are sourcing, contextualization, corroboration, and close reading. On the left, you see questions that we paired with disciplinary literacy. And on the right, we see questions that would be used for critical literacy. So as our teachers and our students approach sources in their inquiry, they wouldn't use all these questions in a given lesson. They wouldn't use all these on a given source. It would be about the student or the teacher making choices on which questions would be appropriate for a given source or for a given inquiry. Typically, when we look at scaffolding skills in social studies, we would begin with sourcing, then contextualization, and so on, moving down. So it is even structured in a way in which you could scaffold those skills throughout. As you see with sourcing, we would be looking at who is creating the source and intended audience of the source, questions they might be familiar with already. But as you see, as we move to the right side of the column, critical literacy adds in this new dimension of looking at who the author actually is and looking at their positionality. So if you're looking at maybe the Declaration of Independence, you're looking at Thomas Jefferson, who created the source would be Thomas Jefferson, and then you could include different people that were part of that committee. But it would be interesting to look at Thomas Jefferson based on his gender, sexuality, ethnicity, race, the various beliefs that Thomas Jefferson had, what class or socioeconomic status he was coming from, whether he had ability or disability, and kind of getting into who Thomas Jefferson was to add a new layer of understanding other than just knowing his name and he's the author. And that's what critical literacy is helping us do. So as we move from the left side of disciplinary literacies, you move to contextualization, looking at when and where a source was created or what authority do they have on that given topic. The critical literacy questions really help add a different layer, a different dimension into our understanding so we can understand, again, that power relationship between the authors of the sources that we're looking at and our students and where they stand and what kind of position the sources are putting our students in. Brian, did you have any thoughts on the source analysis tool page?
Yeah, this is, the game.
Be able to take it in interesting ways, and every student in every class might approach it from a different perspective based on their identity and what they bring to the table. So I thought it'd be helpful to look at a couple of different examples in which this can be used within a classroom. And it's just as simple as bringing 1 or 2 questions in. Again, you see that list, and that's not an all-encompassing list of disciplinary literacy or critical literacy questions that we have, and they can be used. That's an easy, approachable version that we see on the source analysis tool. But it's not even all those. For a given lesson or a given source, it's sometimes just about bringing in 1 or 2 questions, and that can help influence where the inquiry goes. So the teacher would need to think, and the student, if they are given the option to think about what questions they would want to apply, how they want to shape the inquiry. Questions lead inquiry in different directions. And based on the questions they choose, it helps also frame the type of inquiry a student's going to have within a class. So in this example, we see a literacy question. It's what language, words, phrases, images, symbols does the author use to persuade the source's audience? So something I would do in class is try to annotate this and show where some of these are. So some of the words that would really stick out to me when looking at this is, I would understand that the top of this has a title. So often we refer to it as the Boston Massacre, but at the top, Paul Revere, who's the author of this, actually puts a title for us, and it's The Bloody Massacre. And referring to something as a bloody massacre is already telling me, by close reading just the language that is there, what he is trying to say and what he's trying to persuade us on. So if you look at some of those key phrases like persuade the source's audience, I start looking in close reading the image here. And so what I've featured here is how the British troops are depicted in this image. And notice I'm saying depicted because I'm already reflecting that this might not actually be how it is. Paul Revere is saying this is how it is. We often look at this as a historic document, and people might take away that this is how it is, but these questions allow us to explore and break apart and deconstruct what is actually happening in text or within images. So here you see this lineup of the British soldier, that they're organized, they're in uniforms, that they're set up as the military, they're firing upon them. You see the clouds of smoke there. You see the commander in the back giving the order to fire. And then on the other side, again, we're looking at how Paul Revere is trying to persuade us. We see the damage that is done by this. We see the death and destruction that might have happened through this. We see, and it is actually quite graphic for our students. We need to think about how we bring students safely in and safely out of such a source like this. That might be graphic and depends what age level and what students you have in your class. Again, this is labeled as an 8th grade example because it fits within that time frame of what that 8th grade class is. But this is quite graphic on what Paul Revere is showing us. And we're seeing the damage that is done by the British military. And it's positioning us in a certain way to have certain different points of view. We look at similar questions like that with our sourcing question. What is the author's point of view? Well, quite often it's being paired already with that persuasive nature that you see here. Of the author is trying to persuade us in a certain direction. My students even always point out the dog, which I don't have an arrow going to the dog. They're saying, look, even the dog is on the side of the columnist here. Like that the author takes it to that degree that even if you like dogs, you're on the side of the columnist. My students always like pointing that out to me, which I thought was an interesting and funny observation that my students would bring to the table. But again, that's bringing those student experiences and things that they notice to the inquiry that we have. And the last one here for close reading critical literacy would be whose interest does the author serve? And that brings in a whole other level of types of questions here. But obviously through this image, we can see that the author's trying to serve the colonists and trying to persuade by calling it a bloody massacre, by showing the British in a certain way. Ryan, any observations you would like to point out on this source?
My daughter, she's in the 5th grade. We looked at this source together because I was trying to build something, and she just couldn't look at the bloody side. She just couldn't get there, and we talked a lot about that, right? About why Paul Revere tried to do it, and she said it just seems so mean about these, about the British, and she was taking it at face value. And it was only through these types of questions that we were able to sort of unbox, right, or demystify sort of what's happening inside the source. She was taking this, she was reading this for information. She thought this was true, exactly as it is stated here. Because not only am I showing her, right, as her dad, but this looks like a pretty official thing. And so it was the questions and the conversation my daughter and I had after this that really gave a lot of meaning to this, where she starts to see a very healthy skepticism that starts to build in to say, well, I'm not going to just take this at face value. I'm now equipping myself with a series of questions, right, that enable me to look at a source and to sort of poke some holes in it before I am willing to accept it, right? And we all know that's kind of important, right, living in this whole, social media age and so on. But it was a really interesting conversation with my daughter that all resulted from all the little pools of blood that were there, right? She even told me afterwards, I need to start to give this in black and white if possible. And I said, sorry, kid, I just can't do that. So
here's a high school example. And we've really pared down the questions here for, again, disciplinary and critical literacy. There's a lot of different options you could take with this one and other types of literacy we could look at here. If you're looking at this for the first time, there's several things that we could look at here. For disciplinary literacy, again, we did close reading just to keep that commonality for the presentation here. But when you look at this, there's several different things that are kind of sticking out. Some of this is information literacy, but we're going to blur that line here a little bit just to come to an understanding here. One, it says suggested page. Hopefully you probably understand the format and structure of this, that this is also looking like a Facebook ad of some sort. It's sponsored, which is interesting, and it's suggested to me, which makes me wonder about some of those informational literacy that we don't have here. But again, this is language under close reading that you would also be analyzing and looking at through this lens of who is Secured Borders, what is this group, who's the author of this, the author's trying to persuade me, how are they persuading me? They're telling me that this is a news and media website. They're telling me that over 100,000 people have already liked this organization, that this is a popular thing that's being promoted to me through Facebook. So again, it's a blurring of a couple different literacies that we could use to come to understand this. But again, how would I actually deconstruct this ad that's being promoted to me here? So let's take a look at some of the more specific language in here. Notice it says every man, which is interesting that you choose that language. Every man should stand for our borders. What is our borders? R is another interesting word, and it's saying join. Lots of exclamation points. We like seeing exclamation points sometimes. Sometimes they serve a distinct purpose in an ad specifically. The image is also really interesting. Look at the language. If close reading is asking you to look at language, specifically words here, notice it says no invaders. This is a street sign of some sort. So no invaders. I don't know if I've ever seen a sign made by the government, because that's who makes street signs, that has used words like invaders. Usually it's a stop sign or a warning sign of some sort. This one is saying no invaders allowed. This little red arrow that just popped up is looking at the sign itself. Usually I don't see signs in this condition either. This looks like this sign has been run over or beaten up or heavily weathered over time, which would lead me to wonder kind of why it's that way and why they're using that language and why the government would use language like that, like invaders, which is an interesting choice if this was made by a government. And then I have a red arrow that just popped up here on the left if you can't see it, and it's pointing at the location of where it is in respect to the fence. So who's this sign really for? If this is a photo taken at a border, because I would understand that this is a border here, because that's the language we see throughout this ad here. This is a border, no invaders allowed. Would this be if this is an American border, because there's a little American symbol in the image for Secured Borders, the people that are sponsoring this? If this is an American border, if this is on the American side of the territory, why would this sign be up? No invaders allowed. Why is it on the American side? If this is on another side, that means that would have been a sign promoted by another government, whether this is Mexico or Canada. If it's Mexico, why would they put such a sign up on the American border if it is for that audience coming into the border? If it is also for Mexico, why is it in English? Why would it be in that specific language? So if it's in English, does that mean that this is possibly on the Canadian side of the border? It leads to a lot of other questions. So a close reading of this image actually creates a lot of new questions for me, which I think would be excellent conversation that you could have within a class with your students. And sometimes a simple question, a disciplinary simple question like this, really leads to a lot of other questions, which is something that we want to have in social studies, that our students are really taking this inquiry seriously, but it leads to a lot of other conversations for that inquiry and that investigation with whichever the point of the teacher of showing this specific source, which, to be upfront with you, this is actually a Russian Facebook ad from the 2016 election. And close reading again, or sorry, I keep saying close reading because it's the top, but critical literacy there is who is empowered or oppressed by the use of the language. Who would be offended by the message that's being presented here? There's a lot of different groups that we could talk about, specifically with using language like invaders. Again, I don't know if I've seen a government sign that uses language like this. Why would specific language be used in this circumstance? So these two questions lead to a lot of other questions, which could be a lot of interesting engagement and conversation that you would be able to have with your students. Brian, thoughts?
Yeah. So again, just to reiterate, the idea that this could be something you could do at the beginning of your class, right? The students come in, guys, today we're going to be looking at this question, and boom, you throw up a source like this. It's almost like a way of sparking their curiosity and interest at the very beginning, so that at the very beginning of the inquiry, there's all these questions that are just coming in. And you as the teacher are able to sort of take which questions you think might be merited. Maybe it's questions that you anticipated. Maybe it's questions that you did not anticipate. But just these two questions here that Vincent's talked about, the disciplinary and critical literacy, when applied to a source like this, is going to really sort of rev the engine, right? The intellectual engine of your kids' minds, right? To get them thinking about, maybe I can do this with every single source that we see, right? That's what social studies is about, right? Is investigating and interpreting the social world around them to make meaning, right? Whether it's, by the way, in the physical sense, or as Vincent's already pointed out, guys, this is like straight up propaganda from Russia, and 134,000 people were like, "Yep, I'll sign up for that," not even understanding what's happening, right? Questions like Vincent just laid out better enable our current and future citizens, our young folks, to be better prepared for the social world around them.
This is our source analysis tool for K-5. We worked on this with elementary AICs and a few elementary teachers. It's a relatively new document of ours. And what you'll see is a very similar format. We have our 4 areas within disciplinary literacy. And what we've done is we've pared some of the questions down to make it a little more manageable for our K-5 friends. And we've also shifted some of the language. You'll see some of the nature of the disciplinary literacy questions and critical literacy questions are very similar, but we've tried to make the language a little simpler because the previous document was more for middle and high school students. And what we've also done on the critical literacy side is layer in some fiction questions, because we know elementary school teachers work more with fiction and approaching some of our lessons with fiction. So we thought it would be helpful to add in some of those. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's a user-friendly list to begin with for disciplinary literacy and critical literacy for our elementary school teachers and students.
Yeah, and you could even have this as a slide. We've got that available as a slide. Vincent's done that for us, so that you could even put this up as a slide. We just had a training with Pear Deck yesterday. Imagine having this as one of your templates. Students could choose which question they thought was the most relevant based on what they were looking at. Individual groups could do the same. There's a lot of ability and sort of variety that you can bring to this, where it's both teachers choosing for a predetermined lesson, or being able to open this up so students can be able to choose the questions they're wanting to investigate a certain source. Both of those have enormous benefit and merit. All right, Vincent, I know this is my exciting part. I'm so excited about this next part, because we're going to apply this to 2 beloved books.
Well, almost.
Oh, no, I jumped the gun. My bad.
Just barely. This is actually a 5th grade example of a source that we have in our curriculum, and I'll be quick because we are running a little short on time. So in this example, the 5th grade teachers actually had them highlight in green and yellow, looking for specific content literacy aspects that they wanted them to identify within the source. But then we layered in disciplinary and critical literacy. So who made this? Again, similar question that we had in the middle school and high school, just made it a little more approachable. And a teacher could easily annotate this for our students. If it's the first time that they're working with these questions, you can walk them through how we approach and how we look for these answers within a given text to help facilitate that conversation as we scaffold those skills in for our students. So arrow going right here that this is a U.S. Major General. That gives us an idea that he was obviously in the U.S. Army. It gives us a date also. We know this is right around the Civil War. Actually, it's at the end of the Civil War if you know your history. So you can start to make some of those connections. Who do you think this was made for? That was our intended audience question that we saw in the higher grade levels. But who do we make this for? Who do we think it was made for? The arrows again are directing to this is for the people of Texas. They're talking directly to property, the rights of property between former, as they say, former masters and slaves. So it's directing us straight to the language of who they think that this major general was talking to. And then which side was the author on? We see clues of that. So they use content literacy to help identify certain aspects of the discipline, but then they're using critical and disciplinary literacy to pull it apart in more of the way in which social studies or historians would approach this. And the critical literacy lens starts making you wonder why they're using certain language. We know it's U.S. military, but why is the general using language like idleness? And it starts queuing us up to maybe what the perspective of that general was also as we approach this. Ryan, quick observation so we can get to the last slide there.
No, man, I did a fan dance around these last two sources. So this is fantastic, and the way you've diagrammed them is just perfect, right? And this is the kind of stuff that I know you've been working with some elementary folks on that really help teachers break down of how to break this down for their students.
And Ryan, I know you're excited about this. We're going to look at this is a kindergarten example. This is a compelling question straight from our kindergarten curriculum here. It says, can we get everything we need and want? Which I think is just a great question for our students to come into class and start wondering about how we get what we want and what approaches we might have with that. The supporting question for this lesson could be, how do I get what I want? Which is, again, straight from our curriculum. And so we have two books, two beloved books within our favorite conversations to have here on some readings here. Full disclosure, I have some mixed feelings on some of the books that are available here. And so I think in this case, Ryan, for the viewers that might not have read these before, could you maybe describe The Giving Tree just briefly for the audience?
I mean, who doesn't love Shel Silverstein here, right? The Giving Tree, the tree that just gives every single thing to the child who is ungrateful, even to his dying day. I don't know how else to describe it that way. Metaphor for parents, I still have both my arms and my legs, so I guess I'm just not up to the moral caliber of The Giving Tree.
And I thought you'd be a little more friendly than I was going to be. Click Clack Moo is one of my personal favorites. I'm a huge I have a large background in civics and promoting civic education. This is a fun, and it's actually quite funny book about cows that are advocating for themselves and the hens that are also in the barn. They get a hold of a typewriter and they're writing messages to the farmers that they want electric blankets. And it's this entertaining back and forth between them and the farmer about cows being really showing agency for themselves and promoting themselves through negotiation and consensus with the farmer that they're on the farm with. So they're two fun books that a lot of students are familiar with that could pair well with the compelling and supporting question that we have that can help instigate some of the conversations we want to have about how do I get what I want. So provided here are a critical literacy question, specifically under close reading. Which characters do you want to defend or criticize? Brian, I'll let you do that one first.
Yeah, here's the thing about, so there's part of me that just loves The Giving Tree. There's a part of me that says that I as a parent would just do everything under the sun to do that for this kid. The difference is that the tree is willing to sacrifice everything that makes the tree.
And I think it brings up a lot of interesting questions about how do you go about what you want? Is it just asking or kind of demanding without truly being grateful, as I kind of see in The Giving Tree, or Click Clack Moo, where you take agency and advocate for yourself and make requests and negotiate back and forth? It leads to a lot of interesting questions of how do we get what we want, and how do we get everything that we want and need?
That's exactly right. Now, listen, as we're going to be leaving you to Mimi, who's fantastic, we don't want you guys to go the rest of your day saying, man, Ryan and Vincent are these two critical, grizzled dudes. We absolutely love social studies, and we see it everywhere, right, including in kids' books. And we're asking you guys to use questions and find out where the students are thinking about things, how they're looking at it, right? That's our request, because we think that questions are the drivers of conversation. And you all know this. Anytime you want to get to know somebody new, then guess what you start to do? You start to ask questions about that person. Well, we've got a lot of sources that we're reading. We've got a lot of text that kids are engaging in. We want them to ask questions just to get to know those sources too. And Vincent, I think if we got one more slide about contacting us if you need extra help here. There you go, right? So how to use the source analysis tool. We'll make sure this is available on jcpssocialstudies.com. Reach out to us in any way you'd like. Thank you so much for having us this morning.